What up, fam? Welcome to Skill Tree, where we learn how to do just about everything. Okay, so recently the trailer for the new Assassin's Creed game, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, dropped. And fam, it looks dope. And I mean that literally, like the game itself looks like it's gonna be cool, but it looks dope. Especially the costume design for our protagonist here. Now, I had originally had a completely different plan for what I was gonna do for an episode today, but after seeing that little teaser trailer, I had to jump on like a project from this world. I don't know, every once in a while you just see a thing that kind of inspires you, and that, I was done watching it and I was like, yup, that. So, behold my Viking war belt. Also, it turns out known as a kidney belt, this particular design. Now, I tried to make this bad boy as close to the one I can see in the game cinematic and on the marketing material. Well, at least as close as my time and materials would allow. This was like super last minute, so I'm like, what do I have that I could use to make this? Oh, and while doing this, I learned an amazing leather trick that I think you're gonna love. So if you're new to the show and the thumbnail for this one brought you in, just so you know, the way we kind of work here is we go over some skills, and then every additional episode we get better and better at these skills as we go. So a lot of the things that I'm just gonna kind of glance over here are things that have already been covered in other episodes. I will try to drop links up here-ish as those particular skills come, so you can refer back to the episodes where we cover them. Okay, so with all the niceties out of the way, let's go ahead and level up this skill. Getting started. As with most projects, I figured step one should be making a template. So I started by measuring my waist. Now, since I would normally be wearing something like this with like bulkier clothes or armor, I took my waist size of 36 inches and added an extra 2 inches to it. Next, I kind of had to figure out how tall I wanted this to be. So I felt where my rib cage ends and where my hip bone starts, and then I measured the distance between them. Then I cut a band of paper to that size. Now, in order to make this kind of sit on my hips more comfortably, I figured having the sides be a little bit thinner than the front here would just work better. I think that would be a little more comfortable. So I marked where the center of my stomach would be, as well as where my hips would start. Now, those of you with sharp eyes might have noticed that I positioned where the belt opens here to be off center, so it doesn't fall like right in the middle of the back. So initially, the reason why I did this was because I took a freeze frame of that cinematic and I saw that that's kind of how it is in the game. But I actually really came to like it that way though, because it was much easier to kind of adjust things. I'm not like reaching back there trying to buckle things up or having to turn the belt around in order to loosen and tighten things. Everything is right over here, and it kind of makes sense. All right, so next I fold that template in half along the center line, so all of my adjustments will be uniform on both sides. Now remember, that's in half for where I marked my center, not actually in half because I put the opening to be off center. So my half, not its half, if that makes sense. Using the marks I made for hip placement in conjunction with the measurements I took earlier, I marked out the desired width and drew a smooth transition between the two different sizes. Then I cut the whole thing out. The resulting template sat really comfortably and transitioned from 5 inches around the waist to 6 inches around the belly smoothly. But you'll notice that the game kind of adds a second layer of armor by adding an additional layer of leather around there. So to make that template, I just traced a larger pattern onto some paper and then just removed an inch from the top of the piece and cut the whole thing out. This results in a 1/2 of an inch reveal where the two are stacked on top of each other. All right, sweet deal. With our template all good to go, we can move on to prepping the leather. So for this project, I am using this beautiful piece of 9-ounce veg tanned leather. Laying the template down, I traced them out with a pen and then carefully cut them out with a sharp razor. Remember, a sharp razor is way safer than a dull one, so make sure you keep your blades fresh. Once the leather is free, I went to work on all of the edges, front and back, with this edge beveler tool. Then I wet the edges with a sponge and smoothed them out with my slicker brush. I also used a stitch groover to drop a nice straight line for my lace holes to follow. Now, speaking of lace holes, I found myself in a bit of a conundrum. I wanted to make sure all of my holes were evenly spaced apart. Unfortunately, I don't have a tool in my leather kit that has prongs that have a distance that far. So to solve this, I just took these 2 mechanical pencils and taped them together. The resulting tool ended up leaving marks a perfect and uniform distance apart. And using those marks as my guides, I punched each hole with my rotary punch. Okay fam, so you get 1,000,000 points if you can figure out something constructive to do with these. These are just the nubbins that are left over from when I punch holes, and I hate wasting leather, and it just feels like there's so many of them around all the time that if I could find a thing to do with them, that would be great. So yeah, leave in the comments if you have any good ideas of what to do with all those little nubs. All right, so at this point, our belts are looking pretty professional, if I do say so myself. And I do, of course. Notice though, I didn't punch the holes in the end of that top piece there. That's just because the actual belt here passes directly over it, and I just wanted that whole area to lay a little flatter. Oh, and before we move on, another thing to keep in mind is that though I cut both of these pieces the exact same length, the top will appear shorter once it's on. This is just because the leather underneath takes up a bit of extra space. Now, I had figured this in and I was going for that, but if that's not the look you want, I just figured it'd be a good idea to point it out to you. Okay, so now that the main body of our project is all prepped and ready to go, let's jump over to making the laces and belt. Okay, so I am super excited to share this little tip with you. So much so that I have given it its own little section right here. So do you remember when I told you that I hate wasting leather? Well, I'm gonna show you now how to turn just scrap leather into really useful leather cordage. All right, so check this out. First, grab some scrap leather. Next, transcribe a circle onto it and cut said circle out. Okay, so now you're gonna need a strap cutter. If you don't have one and you like working with leather, I highly advise you pick one up. They're super cheap and you save money by being able to manufacture your own pieces. I swear, a little strip of leather that's been cut to the shape of a belt costs more than just a regular piece of leather I can grab and send through my strip cutter there. If you want to purchase one, I'll leave a link to one below. So setting my strap cutter to the desired lace width I want, I start to feed my circle through until there's this little tag, just enough to grab sticking out. And this is where the magic begins. Just grab that tag and pull. Like freaking magic, the leather stays in line and is easily turned into about 7 feet of usable cordage. Then I took this original piece, cut another smaller circle out of it, and made an additional 4 feet of cordage. Now, if you have followed me on this show for any period of time, you know that little useful tricks like this just captivate me. And this technique is no exception. I freaking love that. It's so simple and like, you wouldn't think that you'd just be able to pull it and it would stay in line and just spool itself out, but it worked perfect. And it helps me use up all those little scrap pieces of leather that just kind of collect at the bottom of my box o' leather scraps. So yeah, I'll stop like geeking out over it, but that's awesome, right? That's awesome. Okay, so while I have that strap cutter out, I go ahead and cut out a belt about 1.5 inches wide. I also cut out the space at the end to accommodate this buckle that I stole from an old belt. Finally, I added a point to the other end, wrapping this step up. With that badass little leather tip out in the world, seriously, I love that little hack. We can start tooling and dyeing. So the only tooling I could make out from all the marketing material was this cool knotwork pattern. So I pulled it up on my phone and did my best to draw it onto my template. I also added these little slits for the belt to pass through. Then I wet down my leather and added some plastic over it to keep my paper from turning into mush. Now using a stylus, I traced over my lines, transferring them onto the leather. And with that looking good, I went back over these lines with my swivel knife. Now, I tried to cut these a little bit deeper than usual, as it's a very simple but bold design, and I really wanted it to stand out. And after that's all cut in, I then separated the knot from the background by using my beveler stamp to knock down all the surrounding leather. I also took this time to cut out my belt slits. And already, I am loving the look of this thing. Like, this is just one of those projects that every step you make, you look at it and you go, yeah, that's a thing, I'm making a cool thing. But it is just leather colored, so let's make that sucker pop with some dyes. So for the design portion of it, I decided to use a saddle tan and carefully added the dye with a paintbrush, filling in all of the raised areas as evenly as possible. Next, I busted out this dark brown dye and carefully painted in a border around the designs. Now this darker dye would really clearly show up on the lighter areas if I messed up. So I had to go very slowly and make sure my brush wasn't dripping as I passed over it. But once a safe border was established, I was able to go over the rest of it with a rag in much broader strokes, speeding up the whole process. I also had to make sure that I pressed the dye into my thread groove as well. I also took this time to dye the larger piece, getting everything as even as possible. Now, as you can see, our leather cordage here is dyed a saddle tan as well to go along with that middle design. To get this done, I just shoved them into a container and filled it with the dye. It's lazy and effective. It's like what should be underneath my yearbook picture. Once that color was even, I simply ran the dye cordage through some paper towel as I removed it from the cup, just to get rid of any excess dye. Now, 'twas at this point that I realized I forgot to make these little loops here that are gonna keep everything together. They're just 5¼ inch by 1.5 inch strips that hold all the belts in place. Now, from what I can see in the artwork of the game, it looks like they're just kind of stitched in place with some thread, but I wasn't sure I'd like how that would sit with this kind of wider piece of leather going underneath it. So I decided to change it up by punching holes in them using the same method I used on the belts. Then I dyed them, as well as the main belt. And with those done, everything's looking pretty good. But I don't just want it to look good, this thing gotta look sexy! So to kick it up to 11, I added a coat of Pro Resist. This adds a bit of protection and a lot of shine to the leather. Then I topped it all off with this dark brown antique gel. The antique fills the little cracks and crevices in the leather, giving it a more aged yet uniform appearance. Okay, so now that we do have this thing looking sexy, we can keep this train a-rolling and move on to edge lacing. Now, as you can see in this image, there appears to be some kind of banding all around the edges of his belts. To duplicate this, I first send a bit of my leather cordage through one of the holes. Then I send the opposite tail through the next hole in line and lock that tag end beneath it. By continuing to do this one hole after another, that end gets locked in really securely. Now I simply repeat this action, making my way down the entirety of the edge. Now when I get to that end, I leave the last 4 windings loose, and then send the end back through them. Then I just tighten them down to lock that tail in place, and finish it all off by pulling the tail end tightly. There, by the way, that tail end broke as I pulled it really tightly, but it broke perfectly, so just, you know, that's not what I meant to do. I meant to pull it tight and then nip it off cleanly. I got lucky. I would have been so mad if it broke off and I had to like back it out a few and then put a whole other piece in. That would have been infuriating. Okay, so now we're gonna repeat that action with the larger back piece, but this time I'm going to include these keeper pieces into the weave. To do this, I started wrapping as I did the other belt. When I reached an area that I wanted one of the keepers to sit, I just lined up the holes and passed the cord through both layers. Then I just continued as usual with the same pattern, just adding more keepers as I go. The end result is this beautiful border and these seamlessly incorporated straps. Now all I have to do is pass the smaller tooled piece of leather through those keepers to combine the two halves together. And it was at this point that I noticed something in one of the freeze frames from the cinematic. Check out the tip of his belt. It is awesome and metal, and like 2 weeks ago I took off, so I had a little bit of extra time to make a project just a little bit more awesome. So, pimping the belt. Now before I get to that awesome belt end, I went ahead and dropped in a few rivets just to lock that buckle into place. Okay, so to make this piece, I grabbed this 22 gauge steel sheet. I began by tracing the end of my belt about 1/2 inch away from the edge of the sheet. Next, I drew in these little flaps that I would try to hammer over to lock it into my leather. Then I used my Dremel with the cutting wheel to free the piece from the captivity of the rest of the steel. I also decided to add this little point here just for flavor. So to help those little keeper flaps that I cut in there bend over more evenly, I used my cutting wheel to make a groove along the line where I wanted that bend to happen. Now clamping a piece of metal stock along that cut line, I began to hit the flaps with a ball peen hammer, bending them cleanly over the stock. And this actually worked out way better than I anticipated. So happy with that, I seated the tip of my belt into the metal and pounded the metal flaps over to lock everything in place. This left me with an already pretty cool end piece. But the one in the game seems to have an engraving of some sort on it. To get something similar in place, I put on some of this sticky vinyl usually used for a Cricut cutter. Now unfortunately, no matter what frame I looked at, everything was really blurry and I couldn't make out what the image on that little piece of belt was. So I decided to just draw on a simple design of my own, with my first name spelled out in runes. Then I cut my lines with an X-Acto knife, and removed all of the sections that I wanted to be etched. Now I have gone over etching a couple of times in this channel, but if you need a refresher, just check out this video right here. So after about 5 passes with my cotton, I removed that vinyl to reveal a beautifully clear design. Seriously, I never get tired of removing the vinyl and seeing that like shiny metal underneath. There's just something super satisfying about that. Now to finish off this belt, I just punched the adjustment holes at the end and admired my handiwork. And I'm not gonna lie, I am proud of that belt. Like, I will be able to just remove this belt whenever I please and just use it for like other costume too. Like, it's a cool belt. But to add it to my war belt, all I had to do is slide the end into one of the slits and then back out of the other. Then made sure to pass the ends inside of the keepers. And to add a cherry onto this cake, I tossed in some rivets to match the metal accents shown in the artwork. And bam! I am ready to hunt down Templars while I pillage. Oh, and here's the coolest part. Because of the way the belt kind of weaves in and out of the keepers here, it can be used as a loop to hold things. Sharp things. So there you have it, my Viking kidney belt a la Assassin's Creed Valhalla. That kind of rhymed. So it's funny, doing this show has got me to the point that whenever like a new fantasy show or a video game comes out, rather than watching the content, I'm looking at the things I can make. Like, everything in that cinematic is worthy of an episode. I linked it in the description below. Watch it if you haven't seen it and tell me I'm wrong. But before you go check that out, hit me with that thumbs up love if you liked what you saw here, and do not forget to subscribe so you know when I release new content. Also, if there's a skill you want to see me cover, leave it in the comments below and I will add it to the list. Alright, well I better get going. A representative from a company named Abstergo gave me a call and wanted to meet with me. Not really sure why though. In the meantime, keep leveling up, you.